Hello, everyone. Welcome to Montpelier. It's October 4th, 2024, and we're here for a live webinar called Understanding the Clean Heat Standard. I'm here at the State House. My name is Matt Coda. I own a firm called Meadow Hill. We provide trade association management and advocacy services for nonprofit organizations that are in the energy and transportation space. The Clean Heat Standard is one of the proposals that you're going to hear about over the next 6 months, and many of you are already familiar with it. It is a policy designed to convince Vermonters to use less oil and gas for cooking, heating, and for hot water. It is perhaps the most consequential energy policy dealing with the thermal sector ever considered anywhere. As you know, it is now law. It is going through what is called a regulatory proceeding at the Public Utility Commission. So a little bit of background. So I serve on the Public Utility Commission's Technical Advisory Group. That's a group of hand-selected individuals that are helping guide this policy forward as it goes through the regulatory process at the Public Utility Commission. I also serve on the Equity Advisory Group. That's the organization or the group of individuals that are ensuring that the Clean Heat Standard, if it is implemented by the legislature, does not harm low and moderate income Vermonters and those from historically disadvantaged communities. I'm also appointed by the Speaker of the House to serve on the Climate Council. That's the 23-member panel that is guiding Vermont's climate and energy policy. So a little bit of background before we get to the Clean Heat Standard. The Global Warming Solutions Act was passed in 2020 here in Montpelier. And what that did is it created a climate council to make these recommendations to the legislature and to the different branches of government on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it also set very specific mandates for the state of Vermont to meet. And the first one's coming up in less than 90 days. Vermont is required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors by 26% below 2005 levels by the end of the year, by 2025. It's also required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, the end of the decade. And then further, it's supposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% in 25 years by the year 2050. So the Clean Heat Standard was recommended by the Climate Council several years ago as the #1 way in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal sector, which is the second largest emitter of emissions behind transportation. What the Clean Heat Standard is it's a policy to encourage the adoption of clean heat measures, things like biofuels, renewable natural gas, renewable propane, biodiesel, and renewable diesel, as well as wood heating and electric heating through electric cold climate heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. It will be extremely expensive in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because in 5 years, we've got to shave off 40% below 1990 levels. So there was a study. The legislature passed the law, and there was a study to determine how much this would cost. And we have a number, and it's a big one. It's about $10 billion over the next 25 years. So that's money that is economic activity that needs to occur in order to get Vermonters to use less oil and gas for cooking, for heating, and for hot water. Now, not all of that money would come from existing users of fossil fuels because that number would be more than anyone could afford. If you take 100 million gallons of propane and 100 million gallons of heating oil, which is about what we sell every year in Vermont, and you divide it by the $10 billion, you get to well over $4 a gallon, and that's not what is being proposed. So what is being proposed is a way that you can use incentives and how to raise the cost of heating with oil and gas to encourage people to use less of it. And how it's done is something called a clean heat credit. A clean heat credit is an action taken that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's installing a cold climate heat pump or using biodiesel instead of heating oil. That action earns a credit. Enough credits are needed by those that bring fuel into Vermont in order to reduce their obligation. Those are the obligated parties. There are hundreds of different companies that bring fuel into Vermont and sell them. Everything from the largest propane or heating oil wholesaler to the smallest corner store that sells a barbecue tank and exchanges a barbecue tank. All have to register with the state of Vermont as required, hundreds of them. And then hundreds more are individuals and companies that install or serve clean heat measures. That creates what's called a clean heat credit, which is a tangible commodity. It is, in fact, traded, can be sold, bartered, between companies that need them and companies that have them. It's a very complicated system for how you convince people that install devices and sell energy products that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and require those that continue to sell them and use them to pay for those incentives to help those use less. It's a very interesting program, and a lot of time and money has gone into studying it and to determining whether or not it should be implemented. The Public Utility Commission, as guided by the legislature, is required to produce a rule that the legislature will consider in January to determine whether or not it should become law. They could pass the law, they could amend it, or they could reject it. But the most significant thing that happened this week, which is why we're here live on October 4th to tell you about it, is the first draft regulation of this policy that has been considered for well over 3 years has arrived on our doorstep. It will be finalized, it will be refined, and then it will be brought to the legislature here in January, and whoever takes office in January will determine whether or not it should be implemented. But there are some key takeaways from the regulation, the draft regulation, as presented this week, and they're worth noting. So first of all, according to the Public Utility Commission, the clean heat standard as currently conceived requires substantial additional costs and regulatory complexity above the funding needed to accomplish Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. So while they didn't name the cost of just administering this complicated program, we can point to another study funded by taxpayers by an organization called MV5, in which it indicates about $40 million is needed in order just to administer the program, to get it up and running. If you look at the cost being, or the fee being attributed to fuel taxes or fuel bills, if you think about 100 million gallons of heating oil and 100 million gallons of propane, that equates to about a 20-cent a gallon fee just to get the program running, not to provide any incentives or to train any technicians, but just to get the program running. And the PUC notes that. Another important point, the clean heat standard would require establishing a credit marketplace. That's that trading of credits back and forth, managed by what would be a costly credit platform, and the potential for fraud and market manipulation, the appointment of a new or very developed delivery agents, and administrative costs of their own, and the participation of regulatory engagement of hundreds of fuel dealers and other actors. In other words, this is pretty significant, and it may be too unwieldy. Another quote, our work over the past year and a half on the clean heat standards demonstrates that it does not make sense for Vermont as a lone state to develop a clean heat credit market and the associated clean heat credit trading system to register, sell, and transfer credits. That's an important statement there. This is not from an advocacy organization. This is the Public Utility Commission, who is compelled by law to develop a regulation about the clean heat standard. Finally, because the clean heat standard introduces these additional regulatory hurdles and costs, the Commission is considering other options to achieve Vermont's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals for the thermal sector. What does that mean? Well, that means the legislature has asked the Public Utility Commission, the advisory groups, the Climate Council, the Department of Public Service to develop a regulation. They have a concept of a plan that they handed over, and now the PUC is answering that with their own, with the answer of how they would accomplish that. But they're also suggesting that they are looking at other options. Now, one of those options may be something that was proposed first in 2019. So in 2019, the legislature asked the Public Utility Commission to figure out how to get Vermonters to use less oil and gas for heating, cooking, and water. They came back with a suggestion. Use the existing fee that's been in place for 35 years, that's the 2-cent fuel tax that funds low-income weatherization, and double that to 4 cents a gallon, and then use that money not just for low-income weatherization, but also for all fuels utility to help Vermonters use less fossil fuels to heat their homes, for cooking, and for hot water. That was the proposal in 2019. It was never adopted, and in its place became the Global Warming Solutions Act, which requires Vermont to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and a clean heat standard, which was the tool identified by the Climate Council as the best way in order to achieve that. Now we have a draft regulation, the first draft of the regulation that will be voted on here in January, and it says quite clearly, this might be this might not be possible. If possible, it may be too complicated and too costly to be implemented here in Vermont. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of questions, and there's frankly a lot of misinformation. We have heard over and over again that this, in fact, will not raise the cost of heating. I don't see how that's possible. 70% of Vermonters have fossil fuel delivered to their home, either through a pipe or through a truck into a tank. And those Vermonters who continue to use fossil fuel and their providers will have to pay a fee so that other people can use less. There's no way that that fee doesn't come from the men and women, the local Vermonters that provide that fuel. This is not a fee or a tax on big oil companies from out of the state. Not at all. Anyone bringing fuel into Vermont, from the largest wholesaler in Burlington to the largest pipeline operator to the smallest corner store that is selling and exchanging 4 gallons of propane in a barbecue tank, all are required to register. And if determined by the Public Utility Commission that they brought the fuel into Vermont for ultimate consumption in Vermont, they are then obligated. And the smallest dealer will have to compete in a credit market with some of the largest fossil fuel and energy conglomerates in the state. So it's without question that this fee, this clean heat fee, which is identified in the law, will in fact raise the cost of heating. And it's undoubtedly, given the complexity that we've just heard, will benefit the larger corporations and harm the smallest fuel dealers who help keep this marketplace competitive and are important to the development of these communities and making sure that Vermonters have heat in our cold rural state. So there's a lot at stake in January when the legislature returns, determining what is the appropriate policy. Now I'm going to get to the question that everyone wants to know: what's it going to cost if it's implemented? But before I do that, I want to tell everyone that this is a question and answer session. I want to hear from you. So please, in the chat, feel free to write a question into the chat. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, then feel free to go to cleanheatvt.com, where we have an overview of the clean heat standard, what it is, what it isn't, or what it could be. And you can enter a question in the chat box, and our team at Meadow Hill will absolutely respond to that as soon as we can. So feel free to enter a question in the chat. I will read it live here and answer it, or put it into the message box at cleanheatvt.com, and we will answer it there as well. So while you do that, I just want to say one thing about the fee. We don't know what it will be. We don't. We know that this will cost a significant amount of money to get Vermonters to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal sector by 40% in the next 5 years. There's no way you can do this without money. How are you going to get it? Well, the 200 million gallons, 100 million gallons of heating oil and 100 million gallons of propane that are sold in Vermont will be how they raise the money. And those that continue to use those products will pay a clean heat fee in order to raise the money to encourage people to use less. Again, $10 billion is the number cited by the consulting firm NV5 as the amount of money, the amount of economic activity that is needed in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by the end of the decade and by 80% by the year 2025. We also know from that study that in order to get there, they will depend on the sale of biofuels, replacing heating oil with renewable diesel or biodiesel, and propane with renewable propane, and natural gas with renewable natural gas. That is identified as one of the ways they get there. But whatever the price is, whatever the cost is, will be determined not by the Public Utility Commission, will be determined by the legislature. The legislature will have to determine whether or not how much money will need to be raised in order to meet the legal obligations under the Global Warming Solutions Act. Remember, if Vermont does not meet these mandates, the law is very clear. Any citizen can sue the state for failing to meet those legal obligations. In fact, a lawsuit has already been filed against the state of Vermont for failing to meet the 2025 mandates, which don't happen until December 31st of 2024. There's still time to meet them, but the lawsuit has already been filed. Without a clean heat standard, is it possible that a lawsuit will be filed? Without a adequately funded clean heat standard, is it possible a lawsuit will be filed? Certainly, unless things change here in the legislature in January and that law is altered somehow. So one of the questions that I've got in the chat is from Lisa. Lisa asks, Matt, what about the volatility? I read that volatility, in fact, will go down if we pass the clean heat standard. And that is a phrase that I've often heard from supporters of this law, that they want to reduce volatility. It's true that propane, heating oil, and kerosene, the price goes up and it goes down. Electricity, on the other hand, it simply goes up. It goes up slower, and the price is regulated, but it doesn't go up and down as heating oil and propane does. So the concept that is, if everyone used electricity, then there wouldn't be any volatility. Well, in fact, there would just be prices going up. The reality is that in order to do this energy transformation, in which all of our cars are electric and all of our homes are heated with electricity, according to the research, shows it will take twice the amount of electricity that we currently consume in Vermont. So that's a big number. And there's no prediction that says the price of electricity is going to go down. Heating oil, propane, up and down, sure. Furthermore, when you add a clean heat credit, a credit exchange in which a piece of paper that indicates greenhouse gas emissions has been done, has been verified, and that can be traded in the open market, and larger companies, well-capitalized companies, are competing with smaller companies, the fact of the matter is you're adding more volatility to the fuels market. By creating a credit, another tangible commodity that goes up and goes down depending on demand, you're adding more volatility to a market. In fact, in many ways, the credit exchange could be more volatile than the fuel market. So the argument that we're reducing volatility by passing this legislation simply doesn't bear true. The reality is that a clean heat standard, which adds an additional cost on a credible market, will make it go up and down with more volatility. Any other questions? Thank you. How is the benefit measured? How much impact will it have on global CO2 or global temperatures? Well, the reason why the law was passed in 2020 was because Vermont made a commitment to follow the Paris Climate Accords. Along with 180 countries, Vermont was committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the 40% below 1990 levels, as indicated in the law, certainly no one is under the impression that that work alone will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and lower global temperatures or stabilize global temperatures. But the idea is that that is Vermont's share of this commitment that was made in Paris to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So while no one is saying that this will in fact change the temperature or change the impacts of climate change, it is in fact what many 180 nations agreed to when they signed the Paris Climate Accords. The legislature could change that. The legislature could very easily change that to say that citizens cannot sue the state if they fail to meet those mandates, turn the mandates into goals, or certainly reduce or put the mandates further down the line. Okay, another question. Does the PUC cost estimate take into account deep retrofit, not merely installation necessary to home to use exclusively? New York State estimated about $40,000. So the credits that you can achieve, some will be through weatherization, some will be through the installation of heat pumps, some will be the sale of sustainably sourced biofuels, some will be the installation of wood heating appliances. Every home is different. And so the idea that a single heat pump, while it may provide 99% of the heat for small apartments, for larger homes, particularly older homes that still need to be weatherized, it will provide cooling and reduce the fossil fuel load in the winter, but does not replace it. It may lower the amount of greenhouse gases. It may lower the gallons that you use, but certainly doesn't replace it in a majority of existing homes here in Vermont. We have such an older building stock. So to the questioner, won't that take weatherization? Yes. Weatherization should always go first, because whether you're using an electron or a therm or a gallon, the energy product that you don't use is the energy product that you don't spend, and weatherization is part of it. But weatherization has two problems. One, it is very expensive. And second, it requires a workforce that Vermont does not have. In fact, whether you're installing electric heat pumps and you have to be a licensed electrician, or you're installing solar thermal and you need to be a plumber, or you're installing weatherization. We simply don't have enough tradespeople to do the work required by the law. That's hopefully one of the things that the legislature addresses in January, which is not just figuring out how to pass a fee on fuel users, but figuring out how to change the workforce so that some of these goals, mandates, can be accomplished with a well-trained workforce. Okay, another question. To remain on the Clean Heat Technical and Equity Advisory Groups in the next legislative session, are those committees chosen all over again? Well, we're beyond the Technical Advisory Group until the Clean Heat Standard is either passed or does not pass. Our charge from the legislature is to help the Public Utility Commission as they design this policy, and after it is designed, if it is not implemented, then that goes away. The Climate Council, which I also serve on, will stay. But the Equity Advisory Group and Technical Advisory Group won't have a charge unless the legislature determines that that organization is still needed. Is the CHS issue in the campaign for the Vermont legislature? Yeah, I think so. And there's a lot of misinformation, frankly. There's some people that don't think this will be a fee. That's clearly not true. There's some people that don't think there'll be a cost. It's clearly not true. There's some people that say, oh, it's only on the major oil companies. Not true. In fact, some of the largest energy conglomerates in Vermont, fossil fuel companies, supported this law. It's the small companies, the ones in rural areas, the ones that are where the name on the side of the truck is the person driving the truck or the person answering the phone at 2 a.m. on Christmas Eve to make sure you have heat. They're the ones that live in the community that have been so opposed to this. And I think in those rural areas that talk to their fuel dealers, that go in and see them and talk to their heating contractors, I think for them, it is a campaign issue. But there's lots of campaign issues out there for certain. How likely is the check back report instead of pushing through the CHS, which has already been recommended? The new thermal energy benefit charge on the sale of fuel oil, propane, and kerosene will be established. Would this have a similar process to the CHS in terms of the formation of the regulation? Yeah, that's a really good question. So say you use the existing fee collection mechanism, which is 2 cents a gallon that's paid to the tax department by fuel dealers on the 25th of the month for a gallon sold the prior month, and it's been in place for 35 years. So say you use the known collection system, which a lot of people are advocating for, and you increased it. What would that do? Well, that money would be then go into a fund, which would be used to encourage people to use less heating oil, propane, and kerosene, and natural gas. That the actions taken by whoever receives that fund would be regulated by the Public Utility Commission or some other entity to ensure that that money is spent equitably and purposefully, and they're very efficient about how they spend their efficiency money. And so that could happen. That was proposed way back in 2019, but it was rejected. It could obviously return. What does that mean for those that have already installed clean heat measures or those that want to invest in renewable diesel or biodiesel or renewable propane? Well, we don't know yet. As designed, the Clean Heat Standard would help Vermonters and those who want to sell renewable propane, renewable diesel, biodiesel, renewable natural gas in Vermont. Without a Clean Heat Standard, it's unclear whether or not the sale of those fuels, both now and in the future, would be counted as helping Vermont reach its greenhouse gas reduction mandates. So it's a big question for those that have invested in renewable fuels, for consumers, for fuel dealers and distributors, whether or not this program survives. So what happens now? Lisa asks, what happens if, in fact, this does not become law, if the PUC is correct and that it's just too unwieldy and costly to implement and does not necessarily provide any benefits to Vermonters? What if the legislature reads it and says, okay, we're glad we studied it, we're glad we thought it out, but it may not be exactly what we want in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? What happens now? Well, it's possible that they pass a 4 cent, 5 cent fee on heating fuels in order to raise the money to encourage people to use less. But will it be enough? Will it be enough to meet the legally binding obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030? You could say 2 cents a gallon on 200 million gallons of heating fuel raises $4 million. 4 cents would raise 8. Is $8 million enough to meet those legally binding obligations? Well, you could imagine a scenario where an organization, a legal group, could sue the state of Vermont and saying you didn't raise enough money in order to meet those legally binding obligations. And if the legislature doesn't change those, then they may win. And if they win, then what happens? Well, then a Superior Court judge could order the Agency of Natural Resources to implement rules, regulations, as they do on many things. For instance, your heating oil tank. There are regulations offered by the Agency of Natural Resources which regulate when it has to be inspected, what type of pipes it uses. Same thing with something called the 3-acre rule. There's a rule that's passed that says if you have over 3 acres of impermeable surface, that you have to have a stormwater protection plan. So all of these things happen now, and it could happen in this space. And if that happens, the Agency of Natural Resources will draft regulations, and then 8 people in this building, the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, of which there's typically 5 Democrats and 3 Republicans, will vote. And if 5 out of the 8 approve a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as promoted by the agency, that will in fact have the force of the law. So no bill that's being discussed and debated, nothing signed by a governor. It will be done in a regulatory action. But here's the key. The regulators in a rule, they can certainly put restrictions and they can certainly put requirements, but they can't pass taxes or fees. That is still the responsibility of the people that are elected to serve in the state Senate, the state House of Representatives, and the governor. Okay, a couple more questions. Does Vermont have the infrastructure to be able to support all the new electric users if they convert from oil heat? So when we talk about this energy transformation that has taken place over the last 20 years, the idea is to get all of our electricity from renewable resources and to transform the way we drive and how we heat our homes to that electric sources. The question is there enough? And the studies indicate that we need twice the amount of electricity. Now, can we buy twice the amount of electricity? Sure. It's not about where the energy comes from, but the key is how much does it cost and are we able to transmit it? So Vermont has a law that says that Vermont's electricity has to be 100% renewable. And some of that has to come from in-state resources, though that is more expensive. Typically, it's cleaner, but it's more expensive than buying it on the open market. Further, while you can produce, where you can get that energy, the key is all of our infrastructure that we currently have in place. So I know maybe you live in, or you've been in older homes that have knob and tube wiring, that have a service panel that can accommodate electric car charger and an electric heat pump. And so many of those homes need upgrades. Is that possible? Sure it is, but that just costs money. And more importantly, particularly in Vermont, it takes people who are qualified, who are certified and licensed to do that. And that is the bigger challenge, not where the energy comes from, or can we procure the energy, but can it be distributed here? What is the cost of it? And are the homes ready to accept it and to convert to electric heat and electric cars? Okay. A lot of questions. This is great. Okay, so another question is, sure, there's the simple fee that is being proposed, that may be proposed by the Public Utility Commission, maybe a bill in January, but there's also another program that some of you have heard about called Cap and Invest. So the Climate Council, which I currently serve, is investigating whether an economy-wide cap and invest program is perhaps the more prudent way to go about it. As you know, the Public Utility Commission says it does not make sense, it's quoted, does not make sense for Vermont as a lone state to develop a clean heat credit market. And yes, Vermont is not an island, and we don't have a refinery, we don't have a pipeline, and we don't have a sea terminal here. So our fuel comes from across the border into Vermont, from New York, from Massachusetts, from New Hampshire, and from Quebec. So the idea is, how about partnering with one of those states or those provinces on a cap and invest program, an economy-wide program in which heating oil, propane, natural gas, gasoline, and diesel fuel all are part of a program which users or importers of that fuel will pay into a fee, allowing them to sell, and then that money will be used to reduce consumption, whether it's helping finance electric cars, electric car chargers, or electric heat pumps. That is the program that is also in the very early stages of forming. But it wouldn't be Vermont going it alone. I think we've seen from all of the evidence and all the studies that Vermont going it alone is a very challenging and costly endeavor, but perhaps partnering with either New York or with Quebec or California on such a program. Okay, respecting everyone's time, it is 9 o'clock. I really appreciate you joining here for understanding the Clean Heat Standard. My name is Matt Cota with Meadow Hill, and I encourage you, ask more questions and learn more about the facts about the Clean Heat Standard at cleanheatvt.com. Matt from Montpelier, See you next time.